The doors of VFW Post 2847 creaked open on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, letting in a gust of cold Michigan air that made the American flags along the walls flutter slightly. The men and women inside, most of them well past 60, looked up from their coffee cups and card games to see something none of them expected. A little girl, no more than 8 years old, standing alone in the doorway with a worn photograph clutched against her chest. She had walked there by herself, 3 blocks from the elementary school, past the hardware store and the old diner, through the crisp autumn air that carried the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of the first snow. Her blonde hair was pulled back in 2 uneven braids, the work of someone who was still learning how to do them properly. Her jacket was slightly too big for her small frame. The sleeves rolled up twice at the wrists, and her sneakers had seen better days. But her eyes, those pale blue eyes that seemed too serious for such a young face, scanned the room with a determination that made several veterans straighten in their seats. For a moment, nobody moved. The television in the corner continued playing the afternoon news at a low volume. The coffee maker gurgled in the small kitchen behind the bar. Frank Morrison, who had been in the middle of telling his usual story about his time in Korea to anyone who would listen, fell silent mid-sentence. The ceiling fan rotated slowly overhead, casting moving shadows across the worn linoleum floor that had seen decades of boots and wheelchairs and the tired feet of men and women who had given their best years to their country. The little girl took a deep breath. Her small hands trembled slightly as she held the photograph tighter. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper but somehow carried across the entire hall, she asked the question that would change everything. Who knew my grandpa? Before we continue with this incredible story, if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Your support helps us bring more stories like this one to life, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. The silence that followed her question lasted only 3 heartbeats, but to little Emma Sullivan, it felt like an eternity. She had practiced this moment in her head 100 times on the walk over. She had rehearsed what she would say, how she would stand, how she would hold up the photograph so everyone could see. But standing there in the doorway of the VFW hall, surrounded by strangers who all seemed so much bigger and older than her, she felt her courage beginning to waver. The afternoon light streaming through the dusty windows caught the dust motes floating in the air, making them sparkle like tiny stars. The smell of coffee and old wood and something indefinably masculine filled Emma's nostrils. On the walls, photographs of young men in uniform stared down at her, their faces frozen in time, some of them smiling, others looking deadly serious, all of them impossibly young despite the gravity of their positions. Then something remarkable happened. One by one, the veterans began to stand. First it was Harold Chen, a 73-year-old man with silver hair and a slight limp from a wound he received in Vietnam more than 50 years ago. He pushed himself up from his chair at the nearest table, his weathered hands gripping the edge for support, and faced the little girl with an expression of profound recognition. His face was a map of wrinkles, each line telling a story of years lived and trials endured, but his eyes were clear and sharp. Then it was Margaret Williams, one of the few women in the room, a former army nurse who had served 2 tours in Desert Storm. She rose from her seat by the window, setting down the book she had been reading, her eyes fixed on the photograph in Emma's hands, even though she was too far away to see it clearly. Her grey hair was cut short in a practical style, and she moved with the efficient grace of someone who had spent years navigating hospital corridors under pressure. One after another they stood, men who had served in Korea, in Vietnam, in the Gulf, women who had broken barriers and served their country with distinction, young veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, some still dealing with wounds both visible and invisible. Old veterans who had seen things they rarely spoke about, who carried memories that haunted their dreams, but also forged bonds stronger than steel. Within 60 seconds, 40 veterans were on their feet. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor, of joints creaking and men grunting as they rose, filled the hall. Some of them needed help getting up, and their neighbors provided it without hesitation, arms reaching out to steady those who were unsteady, hands gripping elbows and shoulders with the easy familiarity of people who had been looking out for each other for decades. Emma's eyes went wide. She had hoped that maybe 1 or 2 people might remember her grandfather. She had prepared herself for the possibility that no one would know him at all, that she would have to walk back home with her questions still unanswered. But this was something she had never imagined. "You're Sergeant Sullivan's granddaughter," Harold Chen said, his voice thick with emotion. It wasn't a question. He took a step toward her, moving slowly, carefully, as if approaching a frightened bird that might fly away at any sudden movement. "You have his eyes." Emma nodded, her lower lip trembling. "His name was James Patrick Sullivan. He died before I was born, but my mom always told me stories about him. She said he was a hero." A murmur rippled through the standing veterans. Several of them exchanged glances, and Emma saw something pass between them, some unspoken communication that she was too young to fully understand. Years later, she would recognize it as the silent language of those who have served together, who have shared experiences that bind them in ways that civilians can never quite comprehend. It was the language of foxholes and forward operating bases, of late-night watches and early morning patrols, of moments when the only thing standing between life and death was the person next to you. "Your grandfather," said a man near the back of the room, his voice cracking slightly, "saved my life." Emma turned toward the voice. The speaker was a large man with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they could crush stone. His name was Robert Jackson, and he was 68 years old, though the years had been kind to him physically, if not emotionally. He had a photograph of James Sullivan on his bedroom wall at home, right next to the pictures of his own grandchildren. Every morning when he woke up, he looked at that photograph and said a silent thank you to the man who had given him the chance to grow old. "He saved a lot of our lives," added Margaret Williams, her voice steady but her eyes glistening. "Your grandfather was one of the bravest men I ever knew, and I've known a lot of brave men." Emma felt tears beginning to form in her own eyes, but she blinked them back. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry. She had come here on a mission that had started 3 weeks ago when she found a box of her grandfather's things in the attic of her mother's house. The attic had been dusty and dim, filled with boxes of old clothes and broken furniture and things that nobody had bothered to throw away, but nobody really wanted to keep. Emma had been looking for her Halloween costume from the year before, convinced that it was up there somewhere, when she had stumbled upon a cardboard box tucked away in the corner, hidden behind a stack of old magazines. The box was labeled Dad's Things in her mother's handwriting, and something about those 2 simple words had made Emma's heart race. She had known, even before she opened it, that this was something important. Something that might finally give her answers to questions she had been asking her whole life. Inside the box, she had found treasures, old medals in velvet cases, their ribbons faded but still beautiful. Faded photographs of young men in uniform, laughing and posing and looking impossibly alive. Letters written in handwriting that was neat and careful and somehow sad. Letters that spoke of love and longing and the desperate hope of coming home. And one photograph in particular, the one she now held against her chest, showing a young man in uniform standing with a group of other soldiers, all of them smiling despite the mud on their boots and the exhaustion in their eyes. "Can you tell me about him?" Emma asked. "Please, my mom doesn't like to talk about him much. She says it makes her too sad, and my grandma, she passed away last year, so I can't ask her anymore. I just want to know who he was. I want to know why everyone called him a hero." The question hung in the air like a challenge. It was a simple question, asked with the innocent directness that only a child could manage. But answering it meant revisiting memories that most of these veterans had spent decades trying to make peace with. Frank Morrison, the man who had been telling his career story when Emma walked in, stepped forward. He was 81 years old, the oldest member of VFW Post 2847, and he had been friends with James Sullivan for 35 years before cancer took him. He remembered the day James walked into this very hall for the first time, a young man fresh out of the army, still carrying the weight of everything he had seen and done. He remembered the way James had slowly opened up over the years, the way he had become a mentor to younger veterans, the way he had dedicated his life to helping others who were struggling with the same demons he faced every day. "Come sit down, sweetheart," Frank said gently, gesturing to an empty chair at his table. "We have a lot to tell you. But first, does your mother know you're here?" Emma hesitated. This was the part she had been dreading. She knew she wasn't supposed to go anywhere without telling an adult, and she knew her mother would be worried when she went to pick her up and she wasn't there. But she also knew that if she had asked for permission, the answer probably would have been no. Her mother had made it clear over the years that she didn't want to talk about Grandpa James, that the subject was too painful, that some things were better left in the past. "She's at work. She doesn't get off until 6. I was supposed to go to my friend Lily's house after school, but I told Lily I had something important to do first." Several of the veterans exchanged concerned looks. They understood the impulse that had brought Emma here, the desperate need to know about someone you love who you never got to meet. But they also understood the worry her mother must be feeling, or would be feeling soon. Frank nodded slowly, understanding the situation. "How about we call your mom and let her know where you are? That way she won't worry when she goes to pick you up and you're not there. Would that be okay?" Emma considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, but please don't let her make me leave before you tell me about Grandpa. Please." "I promise," Frank said solemnly. "We'll make sure you hear everything you came to hear. Your grandfather was one of us, which means you're one of us too, and we take care of our own." While Margaret went to find a phone to call Emma's mother, the other veterans slowly returned to their seats, though none of them seemed interested in their card games or coffee anymore. All attention was focused on the little girl who had walked into their hall and asked a question that had awakened memories many of them had kept buried for years. Harold Chen pulled a chair over so he could sit across from Emma. He studied her face for a long moment, marveling at how much she resembled James. Not just her eyes, but the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders back even when she was nervous, the quiet determination that seemed to radiate from her small frame. It was like looking at a ghost, but a welcome ghost, a reminder that the people we love live on in ways we don't always expect. "What do you know about your grandfather?" Harold asked. "What has your mother told you?" Emma thought carefully before answering, her brow furrowing in concentration. "She told me he was in the army a long time ago. She told me he got medals for being brave. She told me he helped a lot of people when he came home. She told me he loved me, even though he never got to meet me, because he knew about me before he died. He knew my mom was going to have a baby, and he was really happy about it." Her voice caught on the last words, and she had to take a moment to compose herself. The idea that her grandfather had known about her, had been happy about her, had loved her even though they had never met, was something that Emma thought about all the time. It was like having a guardian angel, someone watching over her from somewhere far away. Harold smiled, a bittersweet expression that carried decades of memories. "All of that is true, but there's so much more. Your grandfather was one of the finest soldiers I ever served with, and after we came home, he became one of the finest men I ever knew." "Harold's being modest," Robert Jackson said from his seat a few tables away. His deep voice carried easily through the hall. "Your grandfather saved his life too. Saved a lot of our lives. Not just in the war, but after. When things got hard and we didn't know how to keep going." Emma looked around the room at all the faces watching her. Old faces, most of them, lined with years and weathered by experiences she couldn't imagine. But their eyes were bright and focused, fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel important, like what she had come here to learn truly mattered. "How did he save you?" The question hung in the air. It was a simple question, asked with the innocent directness that only a child could manage, but answering it meant revisiting memories that most of these veterans had spent decades trying to make peace with. Frank Morrison was the first to speak. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes taking on a distant look as he traveled back through the years to a time when he was young and scared and convinced he would never make it home alive. "I met your grandfather in 1969, Frank began. "I was 19 years old, just a kid really, even though I thought I was a man. Had just graduated high school the year before, didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, and then my draft number came up. Before I knew it, I was on a plane to a place I'd never heard of, surrounded by other kids who were just as scared as I was." He paused, reaching for his coffee cup, though he didn't drink from it. The cup was a prop, something to do with his hands while he gathered his thoughts. "We were stationed at the same base, part of the same unit. I was terrified. Everyone was terrified, though most of us were too proud to admit it. We'd all seen the news reports, knew what was waiting for us out there in the jungle. Some of the guys dealt with it by acting tough, picking fights, pretending nothing bothered them. Others got quiet, withdrawn, writing long letters home that they weren't sure would ever get sent." Emma listened intently, her photograph now resting on the table in front of her. In the picture, her grandfather was young, maybe 21 or 22, with dark hair and a smile that seemed to light up his entire face despite the circumstances. He had his arms around two other soldiers, all three of them mugging for the camera like they didn't have a care in the world. But if you looked closely, you could see the shadows under their eyes, the tension in their shoulders. "But your grandfather, he was different," Frank continued. "He wasn't fearless, that's not what I mean. He felt the fear just like the rest of us. I saw him pray before every mission, saw him flinch at the sound of gunfire just like anyone else. But he didn't let it stop him from doing what needed to be done. And more importantly, he didn't let it stop him from taking care of the people around him." "What do you mean?" Emma asked. Frank took a moment to formulate his answer. "Some guys, when they're scared, they focus on themselves. It's a survival instinct, nothing to be ashamed of. But your grandfather had this way of looking outward, of noticing when someone else was struggling and stepping in to help. He'd sit with the new guys who couldn't sleep, talking to them about home, about what they were going to do when they got back. He'd share his rations with guys who were too nervous to eat. He'd write letters for soldiers who couldn't write well themselves, taking down their words and making them sound beautiful." Around the room, several veterans were nodding in recognition. They had their own memories of James Sullivan, their own stories of small kindnesses that had made an impossible situation slightly more bearable. "There was this one night," Frank continued, his voice dropping lower as if he was afraid of being overheard by ghosts, "when everything went wrong. We were on patrol, just a routine patrol, supposed to be back at base before midnight. It was hot, even at night, and the jungle was so thick you could barely see the man in front of you. The sounds were the worst part. You'd hear something rustling in the undergrowth, and you never knew if it was an animal or something worse." He paused, taking a moment to compose himself. Even after all these years, the memory still had power over him. His hands had started to shake slightly, and he gripped his coffee cup tighter to steady them. "We got ambushed, bullets everywhere, men screaming. The guy next to me went down in the first volley, and I tried to help him, but then I took a hit to my leg and went down hard myself. The pain was incredible, like nothing I'd ever felt before, like my leg was on fire and being crushed at the same time. I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I knew was that I was going to die in that jungle, thousands of miles from home, and nobody would even know what happened to me. Emma's hands had found their way to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror and fascination. This was so different from the sanitized stories her mother had told her, the vague references to her grandfather being brave. This was real, visceral, terrifying. "Your grandfather found me. Don't ask me how, because I still don't know. In all that chaos, with bullets flying and explosions going off and men running in every direction, he found me. I was lying there in the mud, convinced I was dying, and suddenly there was this face above me, your grandfather's face, and he was saying, 'I've got you, Frank. I've got you. You're going to be okay.'" He paused, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. Nobody in the room pretended not to notice. "And he carried me, Emma. He picked me up and carried me on his back for almost a mile to get me to safety. A mile in the dark, through enemy territory, with my blood soaking through his uniform. I must have weighed 180 pounds at the time, and he carried me like I was nothing. Every time I told him to leave me, to save himself, he just kept going. 'Not leaving you,' he'd say. 'Not leaving anyone.' He could have left me," Frank said, his voice cracking. "A lot of men would have. It would have been the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. Nobody would have blamed him. But your grandfather wasn't interested in safe. He was interested in right." Emma's eyes had grown very wide. "He carried you a whole mile." "Every step of the way. And when we finally got to safety, when the medics took over and started working on my leg, you know what he did? He went back. He went back into that jungle to help the others. By the end of that night, he had pulled 6 men to safety. 6 of us are alive today because your grandfather refused to leave anyone behind." A heavy silence fell over the room. Several of the veterans were staring at their hands or their coffee cups, lost in their own memories of that night, or nights like it. Harold Chen wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, not bothering to pretend he wasn't crying. A young veteran near the back, barely 30 years old, with scars on his face from his own service, was gripping the edge of his table so hard his knuckles had turned white. "That's how he got his first silver star," Harold said quietly. "They wanted to give him more, wanted to give him every medal they could find, but James wasn't interested in medals. He said he was just doing what anyone would have done, but that wasn't true. What he did, not everyone could have done it, not everyone would have done it." Emma absorbed all of this with the serious attention of someone much older than her years. She had always known her grandfather was a hero, but the word had been abstract until now, just a label without real meaning. Now it was becoming something concrete, something she could understand. Not a comic book hero, not someone with special powers or invulnerability, but a regular person who had been scared and tired and in pain and had kept going anyway because other people needed him. "Did he ever get hurt?" she asked. The veterans exchanged another one of those looks, the ones that said more than words could. It was Robert Jackson who finally answered, his deep voice filling the room. "Yeah, sweetheart, he got hurt. More than once. The first time was on a patrol about 6 months after he arrived. Got hit by shrapnel from an explosion, caught him in the shoulder and the side. They patched him up, sent him back out after a few weeks. The second time was worse. He was pulling a wounded man to cover when he got shot in the leg. The same leg," Robert added, with a glance at Frank. "Some people said he was cursed, that his leg was a magnet for bullets, but James just laughed it off, said legs heal, said the important thing was the guy he was pulling made it. But he never complained about it," Robert continued. "He never used his injuries as an excuse for anything. When he came home, when the war was finally over and he was back in the States, he had scars that you could see and scars that you couldn't. Just like the rest of us." "What do you mean, scars you couldn't see?" Robert considered how to explain this to a child. He looked around the room at the other veterans, silently asking for help, and Harold Chen stepped in. Well, when people go through difficult things, really difficult things, sometimes it affects them in ways that don't show on the outside. Sometimes they have bad dreams, or they feel sad for no reason, or they have trouble being around other people. Loud noises might make them jump, or certain smells might bring back memories they'd rather forget. It's called PTSD now, but back when your grandfather came home, we didn't have a name for it. We just called it being damaged goods. Harold, Margaret Williams said softly, a warning in her voice. No, she needs to know, Robert insisted. She needs to know that her grandfather wasn't just a hero in the war. He was a hero every single day after, because he fought a battle that nobody could see, and he won. He won by not giving up, by helping other people who were fighting the same battle, by building a life that meant something even when there were days he probably didn't want to get out of bed. Emma thought about this for a long moment. She was quiet, processing everything she had heard, and the veterans gave her the space to do so. Finally, she spoke, her voice small but steady. My mom has bad dreams sometimes, she said quietly. She doesn't think I know, but I hear her crying at night. Is that because of the scars you can't see? Several of the veterans had to look away. The innocence and insight of the child's question had struck them in places they usually kept well defended. Here was this 8-year-old girl who had never known war, who had never seen combat, understanding something that many adults spent their whole lives trying to deny. Maybe, Frank said gently, losing your father, losing her father, that can leave scars too. Different kind of battle, but still a battle. Grief can do things to people, especially when they don't talk about it. It's like a wound that never gets treated. It doesn't heal right. Margaret Williams returned from making the phone call, her expression thoughtful. She had clearly taken more time than necessary, wanting to give the others a chance to share their stories without interruption. Your mother is on her way, Emma. She was worried at first, but when I explained where you were and why you came, she understood. She said she'll be here in about 40 minutes. That gives us time, Frank said with a nod. Time to tell you more about who James Sullivan really was. Over the next half hour, the veterans of VFW Post 2847 took turns sharing their memories of Emma's grandfather. Each story added another layer to the portrait of a man who had dedicated his life to service, not just in uniform, but in everything he did afterward. Harold Chen told her about the time James organized a Christmas toy drive for military families who were struggling financially. This was back in the 80s, and a lot of veterans were having a hard time finding work. The economy was rough, and if you had gaps in your employment because of service, a lot of employers didn't want to take a chance on you. James knew families who couldn't afford presents for their kids, who were choosing between heating their homes and putting food on the table, and he decided to do something about it. Harold's eyes grew distant with memory. He started small, just asking people at the VFW if they had any old toys they wanted to donate, put up some flyers around town, made some phone calls. Before any of us knew what was happening, he had a whole operation going. Local businesses started donating, churches got involved, the newspaper did a story about it. He worked 18-hour days for weeks to make sure every child had presents under their tree, Harold continued. He said Christmas should be magic for kids, no matter what their parents' bank accounts looked like. And he made it happen. That first year, we helped maybe 20 families. By the time James passed, the toy drive was helping over 200 families every December. It's still going, you know. We call it Sullivan's Sleigh now. Emma's face lit up. Sullivan's Sleigh, that's a real thing. That's a real thing, Harold confirmed. Your grandfather started it over 35 years ago, and it's still helping families today. Every December, this hall fills up with toys and volunteers. Last year, We help 243 families, and every year, when we deliver those presents, we tell people about the man who made it all possible. Your grandfather's legacy is still out there, Emma, making Christmas magic for kids who need it. Margaret Williams shared stories of how James had visited wounded veterans in the hospital, spending hours with men and women who had no other visitors. I met your grandfather through hospital visits. I was working as a VA nurse at the time, and I'd see him come in every Wednesday afternoon like clockwork. Didn't matter what the weather was like, didn't matter if he was feeling well or not. He was there. He'd sit with people for hours, Margaret continued, reading to them, playing cards with them, simply sitting with them when they needed someone to be there. A lot of those patients, they didn't have family who could visit. Either their families lived too far away, or they had pushed their families away because of everything they were dealing with. James became their family. He never missed a week, Margaret said. Rain or shine, healthy or sick, he was there. He said those visits were as much for him as they were for the patients. He said it reminded him why he was still fighting. Emma cocked her head, curious. Still fighting what? Margaret exchanged a glance with the other veterans before answering. The war doesn't always end when you come home, sweetheart. For a lot of veterans, the hardest battles happen after they take off the uniform. Your grandfather understood that better than anyone. He said that every time he helped someone else, it reminded him that his own struggles had a purpose. That maybe everything he went through was so he could be there for the people who needed him. Robert Jackson spoke about the darker times, the times when James's own battles had nearly overwhelmed him. His voice was measured, careful, as if he was handling something fragile. There was a period, maybe 15 years after he came home, when things got really bad for your grandfather. He started pulling away from people, stopped coming to the VFW, stopped answering his phone. We'd see his truck parked in his driveway for days without moving. Neighbors said they never saw him outside. Robert paused, his jaw tight. We were scared. We'd seen other guys go down that road, and not all of them came back. Some of them ended up in hospitals. Some of them ended up on the streets. Some of them... He stopped, unwilling to finish the sentence with a child present. What did you do? Emma asked. A group of us, me and Frank and Harold and a few others, we went to his house one day. Wouldn't take no for an answer. His wife, your grandmother, let us in. She was relieved, I think. She'd been trying to get through to him for weeks and nothing was working. Robert's voice grew quieter. We sat with him in his living room for hours, not talking much, just being there. He was in bad shape, Emma, thin, pale, hadn't shaved in weeks. The house was dark, curtains drawn, like he was trying to hide from the world. We didn't push him. We just sat there, letting him know he wasn't alone. And finally, around midnight, he started to open up. He told us things he'd never told anyone, not even his wife, things that had been eating at him for years, things he thought would destroy him if he ever let them out. Emma held her breath, waiting for the rest of the story. But they didn't destroy him, Robert said. They didn't, because he learned something important that night. He learned that the things you keep locked inside, the things you're afraid to talk about, they only have power over you as long as you let them stay in the dark. Once you bring them into the light, once you share them with people who understand, they start to lose their grip. Frank picked up the thread. That's when your grandfather started the support group. He realized that if he was struggling with these things, other veterans must be too. So he started meeting with them, one-on-one at first, then in small groups. No pressure, no judgment, just a safe space to talk about the stuff that was keeping them up at night. Word spread, Frank continued. Within a few years, veterans were coming from all over the county to be part of those groups. Your grandfather trained other people to lead them, made sure the groups could keep going even when he wasn't there. At one point, there were 5 different groups meeting at this hall every week. Hundreds of veterans, all of them getting help because your grandfather refused to suffer in silence. A veteran Emma hadn't heard from yet spoke up. His name was Daniel Ortiz, and he was in his mid-50s, with grey streaking through his dark hair and a quiet intensity in his eyes. "I was in one of those groups," Daniel said. "This was back in the 90s. I'd just come home from Desert Storm and I was a mess. Couldn't hold down a job, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't sleep through the night without waking up screaming. My wife had left me. My parents didn't know what to do with me. I was on my way to becoming another statistic." He paused, gathering himself. "Someone told me about the support group at the VFW, said there was this guy named James who ran it, a guy who actually understood. I went to one meeting just to see. Told myself if it was stupid I'd leave and never come back." Daniel's voice grew thick with emotion. "Your grandfather was the first person who made me feel like I wasn't crazy. He looked at me and saw someone worth saving, even when I couldn't see it myself. He gave me his phone number, told me to call him any time, day or night. And I did, Emma. I called him at 3 in the morning more times than I can count, and he always answered. He always talked me through it. That man," Daniel said, pointing to the photograph on Emma's table, "that man saved my life, not in some abstract way, but literally. There was a night when I had the gun in my hand, and his voice was the thing that made me put it down. He drove to my apartment in the middle of the night, sat with me until the sun came up, didn't judge me, didn't lecture me, just kept me alive." The room was completely silent. Emma's eyes were shining with tears, but she didn't try to hide them anymore. "He never stopped checking on me after that," Daniel continued. "Even when I got better, even when I got my life back together, he still called every few weeks just to see how I was doing. He came to my second wedding. He held my daughter when she was born. When he got sick, when the cancer was taking him, I sat by his bed, the same way he had sat by mine all those years ago. I told him everything he had given me. I told him he was the reason I had a life worth living." Daniel wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand. "So when you ask why we all stood up when you came through that door, that's why. Your grandfather didn't just serve with us. He served us every day for the rest of his life." Emma was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face. Margaret Williams moved to sit beside her, putting a comforting arm around her shoulders. "I know it's a lot to take in," Margaret said softly. "Your grandfather was an extraordinary man, and extraordinary men leave big footprints. But you don't have to carry all of this alone. We're here. We've always been here, and we always will be." "My mom mentioned that," Emma managed to say through her tears. "She said Grandpa spent a lot of time at the VFW helping people." "He spent more time here than he spent anywhere else," Harold said with a sad smile. "This hall was his second home. These people were his second family, and that's not an exaggeration. When your grandmother got sick, we all took turns bringing them meals, driving her to doctor's appointments, mowing their lawn, because that's what family does. And James Sullivan was the reason we became a family." Emma looked around the room again, really seeing the faces this time. She saw the lines and wrinkles of age, the evidence of lives fully lived. She saw the pride in their eyes when they talked about their service, and the pain that still lingered beneath the surface. She saw the way they looked at each other, with a familiarity and affection that came from decades of shared experience. And she understood, in a way she couldn't have put into words, that her grandfather's legacy wasn't just in the medals in that box in the attic, or the stories people told. His legacy was this room full of people who had become better versions of themselves because they knew him. "Do you have any questions for us?" Margaret asked kindly. "Anything else you want to know?" Emma nodded slowly, thinking. "I want to know why he joined the army in the first place. My mom said he wasn't drafted, that he chose to go. Why would he choose something so scary?" The veterans considered this question carefully. It was a question they had all asked themselves at various points in their lives, and the answers were rarely simple. "For some of us, it was about duty," Frank said. "A sense of obligation to our country, to the values we were raised with. We grew up hearing about our fathers and grandfathers who had served, who had sacrificed, and we wanted to be part of that tradition. For others, it was about opportunity, Harold added. The military gave a lot of young men a chance to see the world, to learn skills, to become something more than they might have been otherwise. A lot of us came from small towns, poor families. The military was a ticket to something bigger. For your grandfather specifically, Harold continued, I think it was about family. His father served in World War II, his grandfather in World War I. Military service was in his blood, part of his identity. He used to say that when you come from a family of soldiers, the question isn't whether you'll serve, but how. He wanted to serve with honor, like the generations before him. He wanted to make them proud. And he did, Robert said firmly. Your grandfather honored his family, his country, and himself every single day of his life. Never forget that, Emma. No matter what else you hear or what else you learn, never forget that your grandfather was a good man, one of the best. The door to the VFW hall opened again, and a woman in her mid-30s stepped inside. She had the same blonde hair as Emma, though hers was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the same pale blue eyes that marked her unmistakably as James Sullivan's daughter. She was wearing a work uniform with her name embroidered on it, Sarah, and she looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from working too many hours and carrying too many burdens alone. But when she saw Emma surrounded by veterans, her expression softened into something almost like relief. "Mom!" Emma jumped up from her chair and ran to her mother, wrapping her arms around her waist. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you where I was going, but I had to come. I had to know about Grandpa." Sarah Sullivan hugged her daughter tightly, pressing her lips to the top of Emma's head. "I know, baby, I know." She looked up at the room full of veterans, her eyes glistening. "I'm sorry if she caused any trouble." "No trouble at all," Frank said, rising from his seat with a warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before Emma's arrival. "She's James's granddaughter. That means she's family." Sarah's composure cracked slightly at those words. She had avoided this place for years, ever since her father's funeral. The memories were too painful, the reminders too raw. Every time she drove past the VFW hall, she would turn her head away, as if not looking at it could somehow make the pain of her loss disappear. But seeing her daughter here, surrounded by people who had loved her father as much as she did, she felt something begin to shift inside her. Not a sudden healing, not a miraculous end to her grief, but a crack in the wall she had built around herself. A hint of light where before there had been only darkness. "I should have brought her here sooner," Sarah admitted quietly. "I should have told her more about him. It was hard. It's still hard." Margaret Williams approached her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Grief doesn't come with a timeline, sweetheart. You deal with it however you need to deal with it. But we're here whenever you're ready. Both of you. Always." Sarah nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. Thank you for talking to her, for telling her about who he was." "She needed to know," Harold said. "And honestly, we needed to remember. Sometimes we get so caught up in our own stuff that we forget to keep the stories alive. Your daughter reminded us why those stories matter." Emma tugged at her mother's sleeve, her face alight with everything she had learned. "Mom, did you know Grandpa saved 6 people in one night? And he started a Christmas toy drive that's still happening? And he had a support group where he helped other veterans? Did you know all that?" Sarah smiled through her tears. "I knew some of it, but there's a lot I didn't know. Maybe we should come back sometime, you and me, and learn more together. Would you like that?" "Yes, can we come back, please?" Frank stepped forward, and something unspoken passed between him and Sarah. A recognition of shared grief, shared loss, shared love for the man who had connected them all. "You're always welcome here, both of you. In fact, if you're interested, we're having a memorial service next month for all the members we've lost over the years. Your father's name will be read. We'd be honored if you'd attend." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "We'll be there, won't we, Emma?" "We'll be there," Emma confirmed with the seriousness of a solemn vow. As Sarah began to gather Emma's things, preparing to leave, Robert Jackson approached them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, from which he extracted a small photograph that had been laminated to protect it. "I want you to have this," he said, handing the photo to Emma. "It's from right after that night, the night Frank told you about. Your grandfather didn't know anyone was taking pictures. He was just sitting there, exhausted, covered in mud and blood, and someone snapped this shot. I've carried it with me for over 50 years. It reminds me why I'm still here, why any of us are still here. But I think maybe you should have it now. I think James would want you to have it." Emma looked at the photograph. Her grandfather was younger in this picture than in the one she had brought with her, and he looked utterly spent, like he had given everything he had. His uniform was torn and dirty, his face smeared with grime and sweat, and what might have been tears. But there was something in his eyes, even then, that spoke of strength and determination and an unshakable commitment to the people around him. Not the polished heroism of movies and comic books, but something rawer and more real. The heroism of someone who was scared and exhausted and pushed past all limits, and who kept going anyway. "Thank you," Emma whispered, clutching the photo to her chest the same way she had held her own photograph when she walked in. Robert nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you, Emma. Thank you for reminding us that the people we love don't really leave us. They live on in the people they influenced, in the stories we tell, in the lives they made possible. Your grandfather is gone, but look around this room. He's still here in every single one of us." Emma looked around one more time, memorizing the faces of the men and women who had known her grandfather. She made a silent promise to herself that she would come back, that she would learn all their names and all their stories, that she would keep her grandfather's memory alive just as they had kept it alive for her. As mother and daughter walked toward the door, Frank called out one last time, "Emma!" She turned back, her hand in her mother's. "Your grandfather would be very proud of you, walking in here all by yourself, asking the questions that needed to be asked. That took courage. That's a Sullivan move if I ever saw one." Emma smiled, her first real smile since she had walked into the hall. "Thanks, Mr. Morrison. I'll see you next month." "Looking forward to it." The door closed behind them, and the veterans of VFW Post 2847 stood in silence for a long moment, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Then, slowly, they began to return to their seats, their coffee cups, their card games. But something had changed. The air felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight they hadn't realized they were carrying had been lifted. Frank settled back into his chair and looked around at his fellow veterans. "Well," he said quietly, "I'd say James is still taking care of us, even now." Harold nodded in agreement. "That he is, Frank, that he is." The weeks that followed Emma's visit to the VFW hall brought changes that no one had anticipated. Sarah, who had avoided her father's memory for so long, found herself gradually opening up to her daughter. She dug out more photographs from the attic, along with letters and medals and mementos she had packed away years ago, things she had thought she would never be able to look at again. Together, mother and daughter created a memory book, filling it with pictures and stories and details of James Sullivan's life. They sat at the kitchen table night after night, Sarah sharing memories she had kept locked away, Emma asking questions that helped her mother remember things she had forgotten. It wasn't easy. There were nights when Sarah would have to stop, overwhelmed by grief and guilt and the weight of all the years she had kept her father at a distance, even in death. Sometimes she would excuse herself and go to her room, and Emma would hear her crying through the thin walls. But Emma was patient and understanding in a way that seemed beyond her years, and together they pushed through the hard parts. "Why didn't you ever tell me about the toy drive?" Emma asked one evening as they were sorting through a box of old newspaper clippings. The clippings were yellow with age, their edges crumbling, but the stories they told were still readable. "Why didn't you tell me about the support group?" Sarah sighed, setting down the clipping she had been reading. It was an article from the local paper, dated 1987, with the headline, "Local Veteran Helps Hundreds Through Holiday Toy Drive." There was a photograph of her father, younger than she remembered him, surrounded by boxes of wrapped presents. "Honestly, baby, I think I was jealous. When I was growing up, it felt like your grandfather gave everything to everyone else. The veterans, the community, the people he was always helping. Sometimes there wasn't much left for us, for me and your grandmother. I knew he loved us, I never doubted that. Doubted. But I also knew that something inside him belonged to someone else, to the war, to the people he served with, and I was too young and too selfish to understand why. Do you understand now?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, thinking about how to answer. "I'm starting to. Coming back to the VFW, seeing those people, hearing their stories, it helped me see him differently. He wasn't choosing them over us. He was trying to make sense of everything he'd been through. He was trying to save himself by saving others. And in the process, he created this incredible community of people who loved him, who still love him. That's not something to be jealous of. That's something to be proud of." Emma nodded, adding another clipping to the memory book. "I think he'd be proud of you too, Mom, for talking about it, for bringing me to the VFW, for not being scared anymore." Sarah pulled her daughter into a hug, holding her tight. "When did you get so wise, huh? 8 years old and already teaching your mother life lessons." "I learned from Grandpa," Emma said simply. "Even though I never met him, I learned from him." The memorial service at VFW Post 2847 was held on a cold Saturday in early December. The hall had been transformed for the occasion, with photographs of fallen veterans lining the walls and flowers arranged on every table. White cloths covered the usually bare tables, and someone had put up a banner that read "Never Forgotten" in gold letters against a blue background. Nearly 100 people were in attendance, far more than the usual crowd, and many of them were family members of veterans who had passed over the years. The room was filled with the quiet murmur of conversation, the rustle of tissues, the occasional sound of someone clearing their throat to hold back tears. Emma and Sarah arrived early, both of them wearing their best clothes. Sarah had found a dress in the back of her closet that she hadn't worn since her father's funeral, a simple black dress that had fit her perfectly back then and still fit her now. Emma wore a dark blue dress that Margaret Williams had helped her pick out at the thrift store, along with a ribbon in her hair that matched her grandfather's favorite color. The ceremony was simple but moving. A color guard presented the flags, moving with the precise choreography of people who had done this many times before, but who treated each time as if it were the first. A bugler played taps, the mournful notes filling the hall and bringing tears to many eyes. And then the names were read aloud, each one followed by a moment of silence. The list was long. Men who had served in World War II and Korea, their ranks thinning every year as the last survivors of those conflicts passed away. Men and women who had served in Vietnam, many of them gone too soon from causes related to their service. Veterans of every conflict since, each name a reminder of the cost of freedom. When James Patrick Sullivan's name was called, every veteran in the room stood and placed their hands over their hearts. Emma felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't try to stop them. She understood now that tears weren't a sign of weakness. They were a sign of love, of remembrance, of the connection between past and present that could never be broken. After the formal ceremony ended, people mingled and shared stories. Emma found herself surrounded by veterans she hadn't met before, each of them eager to tell her something about her grandfather. A woman named Patricia, who had served as an army medic in the 1980s, told Emma about the time James had organized a reunion for all the members of his original unit. Most of them had lost touch over the years. Your grandfather spent months tracking them down, making phone calls, writing letters. This was before the internet, remember, before email or Facebook or any of that. He had to do it the hard way, following paper trails, calling old phone numbers, reaching out to family members of guys who had moved. Patricia smiled at the memory. He wanted to bring everyone together one last time, to remind them that they weren't alone, that the bonds they formed still mattered. The reunion was amazing. Grown men crying, hugging each other, catching up on 30 years of life. Some of them hadn't seen each other since the day they left the jungle. Your grandfather made that happen. A young man named Derek, barely out of his 20s and still recovering from injuries he'd received overseas, told Emma about how James had visited him in the hospital when he first came home. His arm was in a sling, and one side of his face bore the marks of burns that were still healing. "I was in a bad place, mentally and physically," Derek said. "Didn't want to see anyone, didn't want to talk to anyone. I told the nurses to send away everyone except my mom, and even my mom I could barely stand to see. But this old guy, your grandfather, he just kept showing up, wouldn't take no for an answer." Derek shook his head in wonder. He'd sit with me for hours, not saying much, just being there. Sometimes he'd read the newspaper out loud, tell me about the sports scores, stuff like that. Sometimes he'd just sit there in silence. Eventually I started to open up to him. He understood what I was going through in a way that no one else could. He saved my life, Emma. I mean that literally. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be standing here today. Each story added another dimension to Emma's understanding of who her grandfather had been. He wasn't just a war hero, though he was certainly that. He was a man who had taken his own pain and transformed it into compassion for others. He was a man who understood that the real battles often begin after the shooting stops. He was a man who had made it his mission to ensure that no one felt as alone as he had once felt. As the afternoon wore on, Emma noticed her mother in deep conversation with Frank Morrison. They were standing near the memorial wall, looking at a photograph of James that had been placed there years ago. Sarah was crying, but she was also smiling, and Frank had his hand on her shoulder in a gesture of comfort and understanding. Emma walked over to join them. "What are you talking about?" Sarah wiped her eyes and put an arm around her daughter. "Frank was telling me about the last conversation he had with your grandfather. It was a few days before he passed." "What did he say?" Emma asked, looking up at Frank. Frank's expression was gentle, his eyes soft with memory. "He talked about you, Emma. He knew he wasn't going to meet you, knew the cancer had spread too far, but he wanted me to promise that I'd look out for you and your mother, that I'd make sure you knew who he was and what he stood for. I promised him I would. I think I failed at that for a while. But thanks to you walking into this hall that day, I finally got the chance to keep my promise." Emma reached out and took Frank's weathered hand in her small one. "You didn't fail. You were here when I needed you. You told me the stories I needed to hear. That's what Grandpa wanted, right? For the stories to keep going?" Frank squeezed her hand, his eyes bright with emotion. "That's exactly what he wanted, and you're going to be the one who carries them forward now. You and your mother and everyone else who loved him. That's how people live on, Emma. Through the stories we tell and the love we keep alive." The months that followed the memorial service marked a turning point for the Sullivan family. Sarah began volunteering at the VFW, helping to organize the annual toy drive that her father had started so many years ago. It was hard at first, being in the space where he had spent so much of his time, seeing his name on plaques and banners and hearing his name spoken with such reverence. But gradually, the pain began to ease. replaced by a sense of connection and purpose that she hadn't felt in years. She found herself looking forward to her shifts at the VFW, to the camaraderie of the veterans, to the feeling of being part of something bigger than herself. For the first time since her father's death, she felt close to him again, not in a sad way, but in a way that gave her strength. Emma became a regular presence at the VFW as well, stopping by after school whenever she could. The veterans adopted her as an unofficial mascot, teaching her card games and sharing stories and slipping her extra cookies when Margaret wasn't looking. She learned all their names and all their stories, just as she had promised herself she would. And in return, she brought a lightness and joy to the hall that had been missing for a long time. But perhaps the most significant change was in Emma herself. The little girl who had walked into the VFW hall that November afternoon, lonely and searching for answers, had found something far more valuable than information about her grandfather. She had found a community, a sense of belonging, a connection to something larger than herself. And she had discovered a purpose that would guide her for years to come. It started small. Emma began writing down the stories she heard at the VFW, filling notebooks with the memories and experiences of the veterans she had come to love. She asked questions, lots of questions, the way she had asked about her grandfather on that first day. And the veterans, who had kept so much locked inside for so long, found themselves opening up to this earnest young girl in ways they never had before. "Why do you keep asking so many questions?" Harold Chen asked her one afternoon, not unkindly, as she scribbled in her notebook. Emma looked up at him, her expression serious. "Because the stories matter. Because if nobody writes them down, they'll be forgotten. Because my grandpa would want me to." Harold stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right, Emma, he would want that, and I think you might be the perfect person to do it." When Emma was 12, she started a project at her school to interview local veterans and create a digital archive of their stories. The project began as a simple assignment for her history class, but it quickly grew beyond anything she had imagined. Teachers noticed the quality of her work and encouraged her to expand it. The local newspaper did a story about her. A professor at the nearby university reached out, offering to help her set up a proper archive. The project won regional and then state recognition, and it grew to include veterans from across Michigan. By the time Emma was 15, the archive contained over 500 interviews, each one a testament to the service and sacrifice of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. "You've built something amazing here," Sarah told her daughter one evening, scrolling through the archive on their home computer. "Your grandfather would be so proud." "I know," Emma said, and there was no arrogance in her voice, only quiet certainty. "That's why I keep doing it, because I know this is what he would have wanted, not the recognition or the awards, but the connections, the stories being told, the people feeling heard." "You really are his granddaughter," Sarah said, her eyes misting over. "I see so much of him in you." "I hope so. I hope I make him proud every single day." When Emma turned 18, she made an announcement that surprised no one who knew her. She was joining the army, following in the footsteps of her grandfather and the generations before him. The decision was met with a mix of pride and worry from her mother, who understood better than anyone the weight of what her daughter was taking on. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, sitting across from Emma at the kitchen table, the same table where they had pored over photographs and memories years ago. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to prove anything to anyone." "I know I don't have to," Emma said calmly, "but I want to. This isn't about proving anything, Mom. It's about continuing something. Grandpa served, his father served, his grandfather served. It's in our blood, just like Mr. Chen said. And I want to serve in my own way, in my own time, for my own reasons." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Emma could see the worry in her eyes, the fear of losing her daughter the way she had lost her father. But beneath the worry, there was something else. Pride, understanding, acceptance. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you," Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He would be so incredibly proud." Emma reached across the table and took her mother's hands. "He's watching, Mom. I know he is. And I promise you, I'm going to honor his memory. I'm going to serve with the same courage and compassion that he did. And I'm going to come home. I'm going to come home and keep telling the stories, keep building the connections, keep making sure that no one is forgotten." On the day Emma left for basic training, the veterans of VFW Post 2847 organized a send-off that rivaled any event in the hall's history. Every member who could make it was there, along with Sarah and dozens of community members who had come to know and love the girl who had walked into the hall asking about her grandfather all those years ago. Frank Morrison, now 89 years old and moving more slowly than he used to, but no less sharp, gave a speech that left few dry eyes in the room. When Emma Sullivan walked into this hall 10 years ago, she was just a little girl with a photograph and a question. She wanted to know about her grandfather, and we told her what we could. But what we didn't realize, what none of us could have known at the time, was that she was going to teach us far more than we ever taught her. He paused, looking around the room at the faces he had known for decades, at the young woman standing before him who had become such an important part of all their lives. Emma reminded us why we do what we do. She reminded us that the stories we carry matter, that they need to be told, that they connect us to each other and to the future. She built something incredible with that archive of hers, something that will outlast all of us. And now she's going out to create her own stories, to make her own mark on the world. He turned to face Emma directly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your grandfather was one of the finest men I ever knew, and I see so much of him in you, the same courage, the same compassion, the same stubborn determination to do what's right even when it's hard. He would be proud of you, Emma Sullivan. We're all proud of you, and we'll be here waiting when you come home." Emma stepped forward and embraced the old man, holding him tight for a long moment. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison, for everything, for telling me about Grandpa, for being there for my mom and me, for keeping his memory alive." "That's what family does," Frank said, his voice rough with emotion. "And your family, Emma. Never forget that." As Emma prepared to leave, her mother at her side and the veterans of VFW Post 2847 watching from the doorway, she turned back one last time to look at the hall that had changed her life. She saw the American flags hanging on the walls, the photographs of veterans past and present, the worn tables where card games and conversations had taken place for generations. She saw the faces of the men and women who had served their country and then dedicated themselves to serving each other. She saw her grandfather's photograph on the memorial wall, his eyes seeming to meet hers across the years. And she made a silent promise, the same promise she had made to herself when she was 8 years old, standing in that doorway for the first time. She would remember, she would honor, she would serve, and she would come back. The years that followed Emma's departure were filled with challenges and triumphs that tested her in ways she had never imagined. Basic training pushed her to her physical and mental limits, breaking her down and building her back up into something stronger. There were moments when she wanted to quit, when the exhaustion and the pain and the relentless demands seemed impossible to meet. But every time she felt herself faltering, she thought of her grandfather. She thought of him carrying Frank Morrison on his back through a mile of hostile jungle, his muscles screaming, his lungs burning, but never stopping, never giving up. She thought of him sitting in dark rooms with broken veterans, offering nothing but his presence and his understanding, staying awake night after night because someone needed him. She thought of him building something out of nothing, creating a community of healing out of his own wounds. And she kept going. Emma excelled in her training, graduating near the top of her class. She was assigned to a medical support unit, a choice that had felt right from the moment she made it. She wanted to help people, to heal them, to be there in their darkest moments the way her grandfather had been there for so many others. Her first deployment was to a base overseas, where she spent 18 months treating soldiers with injuries, both physical and psychological. It was difficult work, heartbreaking work, but also deeply rewarding. She saw the impact she was making, the lives she was touching, and she understood more fully than ever why her grandfather had dedicated himself to this mission. She also saw the cost. She saw young men and women who would never be the same, who would carry their wounds for the rest of their lives. She saw the fear and the exhaustion and the invisible scars that formed in the spaces between firefights. And she did what she could, which was sometimes not enough but was always something. During her deployment, Emma kept in touch with the veterans back home, through letters and emails and occasional phone calls when the connection was good enough. Frank Morrison was in failing health, she learned, his body finally beginning to give out after decades of stubborn refusal. But his spirit remained strong, and he never missed an opportunity to tell Emma how proud he was of her. "You're carrying on the legacy," he wrote in one of his last letters to her. "Not just your grandfather's legacy, but all of ours. Every veteran who ever served, every person who ever sacrificed something for something greater than themselves. You're the thread that connects us all, Emma. Don't ever forget how important that is." Frank Morrison passed away 3 months before Emma completed her deployment. She learned of his death through a somber phone call from her mother, and she spent that night alone in her quarters, looking at the photograph Robert Jackson had given her all those years ago. The young man in the picture, exhausted and covered in mud, seemed to look back at her with understanding. "I'll keep my promise," she whispered to the photograph. "I'll keep all of them." When Emma returned home, she was 23 years old and a different person than the one who had left. She carried her own invisible scars now, memories of things she had seen and done that would stay with her forever. But she also carried a strength and a clarity of purpose that she had never had before. Her first stop was VFW Post 2847. The hall hadn't changed much in the years she'd been away. The same flags on the walls, the same worn tables, the same coffee maker gurgling in the kitchen. But many of the faces were new, younger veterans who had joined in her absence, and some of the faces she had known were missing, lost to time and age and the inevitable march of years. Harold Chen was still there, though, now the oldest member of the post at 84. He stood up when Emma walked through the door, just as he had stood up when she walked through it for the first time 15 years earlier. "Welcome home, soldier," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. Emma saluted him, a gesture of respect and love and acknowledgement of everything they had shared. "It's good to be home, Mr. Chen. It's so good to be home." Over the next few years, Emma built a life that would have made her grandfather proud. She continued her work with the Veteran Archive Project, expanding it to include veterans from across the country. She became a counselor, specializing in helping veterans transition back to civilian life. She spoke at schools and community events, sharing the stories she had collected and the lessons she had learned. And she never forgot where it all began. Every Tuesday afternoon, Emma could be found at VFW Post 2847, sitting at one of the worn tables, listening to the stories of the veterans who gathered there. Some of them were old friends, people she had known since she was 8 years old. Others were newcomers, young men and women just back from their own deployments, struggling to make sense of what they had experienced. To all of them, Emma offered what her grandfather had offered to so many others: presence, understanding, the simple but profound gift of being truly seen and heard. On Tuesday afternoon, about 5 years after her return from deployment, Emma was sitting with a young veteran named Marcus, who was having a particularly difficult day. He was 26 years old, with a shaved head and tattoos covering both arms, but his eyes had the haunted look of someone much older. "I don't know how to do this," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "I don't know how to be a normal person anymore. Everyone keeps telling me to move on, to get over it, but they don't understand. They can't understand." Emma reached across the table and took his hand, the same way she had taken Frank Morrison's hand all those years ago. "You're right," she said quietly. "They don't understand. Most people can't understand what you've been through, and that's not their fault. But you know who does understand? The people in this room, the people who have walked the same road you're walking. They're not going to tell you to move on or get over it. They're going to sit with you while you figure out how to carry it." Marcus looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "How did you learn to carry it?" Emma was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully. "I had help. I had people who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I had stories of people who had faced the same struggles and found their way through. And I had something to hold on to, a sense of purpose that gave meaning to everything I'd been through." She paused, thinking of her grandfather, of Frank Morrison, of all the veterans who had shaped her life. "My grandfather used to say that the weight we carry doesn't get lighter, we just get stronger. And the way we get stronger is by leaning on each other, by sharing the load, by remembering that we're not alone even when it feels like we are." Marcus was silent for a long moment, processing her words. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Will you help me?" he asked. "Will you help me get stronger?" Emma smiled, squeezing his hand. "That's why I'm here. That's why we're all here. You're not alone anymore, Marcus. You never have to be alone again." Years passed. Marcus got stronger, just as Emma had promised he would. He became a regular at the VFW, then a leader, then someone who helped others the way he had been helped. The cycle continued, each generation of veterans passing on the lessons they had learned to the next. Emma married a man she met through her counseling work, another veteran who understood the parts of her that most people couldn't see. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and they raised them with the same values that had been passed down through the Sullivan family for generations: service, compassion, the unshakable belief that everyone deserves someone in their corner. When Emma's daughter turned 8 years old, Emma took her to VFW Post 2847 for the first time. The hall had changed over the years, modernized in some ways, but the essential character remained the same. The flags on the walls, the photographs of veterans, the sense of belonging that filled the air like something you could breathe. "This is where Mommy's story really began," Emma told her daughter, holding her hand as they walked through the door. "And this is where great-grandpa James's story lives on." The door to VFW Post 2847 opened, letting in a gust of warm summer air. A young girl stepped inside, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with dark hair and serious eyes. She was clutching a photograph in her hands, holding it against her chest, like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Excuse me," the girl said, her voice small but determined. "My name is Sophie. My grandpa used to come here a long time ago. His name was Marcus. He passed away last year, and my mom said maybe someone here could tell me about him." Emma felt her breath catch in her throat. Decades had passed since she had stood in this same doorway, asking the same question about her own grandfather. The circle was complete. She stood up from her table and walked toward the girl, kneeling down so they were at eye level. "I knew your grandfather," Emma said gently. "I knew him very well. Would you like me to tell you about him?" Sophie's eyes lit up with hope. "Yes, please. I want to know who he was. I want to know why everyone called him a hero." Emma smiled, feeling the presence of everyone who had come before, everyone who had shaped her, everyone whose stories she had carried. "Come sit down, sweetheart," she said, taking Sophie's hand. "We have a lot to tell you." And as the veterans of VFW Post 2847 gathered around, ready to share another story, Emma understood something that her grandfather had known all along. The stories we tell don't just connect us to the past. They connect us to each other, to the future, to something larger and more enduring than any single life. That's the real legacy, she thought. Not the medals or the honors or the plaques on the wall. It's the connections we make. It's the lives we touch. It's the simple act of being there for each other, of remembering and being remembered. And as she began to tell Sophie about her grandfather, about the young veteran who had walked into this very hall years ago, lost and struggling and desperate for someone to understand, Emma felt her own grandfather's presence like a hand on her shoulder. "I kept my promise," she whispered silently. "The stories will keep going forever." The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows of VFW Post 2847, illuminating the faces of veterans young and old, bound together by service and sacrifice and the unbreakable bonds of those who have walked the same road. And in the center of them all, a young girl listened with wide eyes as the stories unfolded, carrying her grandfather's memory forward into the future. Just as it had always been, just as it would always be. Because that's what heroes do, not through extraordinary acts of courage on distant battlefields, though there is that too, but through the quieter heroism of showing up, of being present, of refusing to let anyone face their darkness alone. James Sullivan knew that, Frank Morrison knew that, Emma knew that, Marcus knew that. And now Sophie would learn it too. The legacy continues.